Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a very special bonus episode of Thinking in English. Today, we have another interview. I am going to be talking with Peter. If you're a Patreon member, you may know Peter. He helps run conversation clubs. He runs the Thinking in English Film Club and teaches lots of English classes. But today, we're not talking about English study. I wanted to ask Peter about his educational background, and in particular, ask him about studying at the world's best university, the University of Cambridge. Peter did his master's degree, a Master of Philosophy, in philosophy at the University of Cambridge a few years ago, and now he works full-time as an English teacher and works closely with Thinking in English. I really enjoyed this episode. I really enjoyed talking to Peter, and this is a new style of video interview. If you enjoy it, maybe I will do more in the future. For Patreon members, you can listen to this as an audio podcast, but it will also be put on YouTube as well. I really recommend watching the video because I put vocabulary and I've done some editing to help make this video easier to watch. But that's enough of an introduction for me. Here is today's interview. Peter, thank you so much for coming on to today's podcast. As my audience probably can tell from the title of this episode, you studied at one of the best universities in the world, Cambridge University. So can you tell us, how did you end up studying at the University of Cambridge?
Absolutely. And I'd just like to quickly say thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to chat on the podcast, something we've been speaking about for a while. Glad that we've made it a reality. Studying at Cambridge was a really interesting experience for me. Definitely something that I didn't really think would ever happen. I applied to Cambridge as a postgraduate, which means I didn't start straight after school in order to do a 3 or 4 year degree. Instead, I did it after I had already finished my first degree and I wanted to study a little bit more. I wanted to do a master's or maybe even a PhD in the future. And I really wanted to take my research a little bit further in the best way I could. I wanted to go to the best university that I could and the place where I thought I could do my projects with the best possible supervisor or the best possible resources.
Yeah, that's similar to me. I tried to apply to the University of Oxford. Unfortunately, did not get accepted for their 2-year MPhil program, but I went to SOAS in London, which was also quite a highly ranked university. What did you actually study?
My subject was philosophy, which I always think is actually a little bit entertaining for this particular degree because the specific type of master's is called a Master's of Philosophy. But that doesn't talk about the subject. That's just the name of the type of qualification. Because my qualification in the end is a Master's of Philosophy of Philosophy. I studied philosophy as for my undergraduate degree. It was something I really enjoyed. And by the time I finished my dissertation at the end of my undergraduate degree, I was ready to take it a little bit further. So I was very much continuing on the same tracks that I had left off in my undergraduate degree.
What attracted you to philosophy specifically? What type of philosophy did you study?
The attraction to philosophy was something that happened a little bit gradually and actually not too dissimilar to Cambridge University. I was not expecting to do it at university. It was actually only after a little bit of time out after school that I decided to study philosophy instead of another subject because, to be honest, in that moment, it felt easier in a certain way. I just think it seemed kind of interesting and it seemed a little bit less hard work and a little bit like something that I could get excited to study without thinking too much about what it entailed. So then it was really during the 3 years of the undergraduate degree that I decided I actually really loved this. And I specifically got very involved in my area of philosophy, which for me was consciousness, which is quite a difficult word in English in general, because it gets confused with some other very different words like conscious and conscientiousness. However, even just the word consciousness in English has many different definitions that people struggle with. So what I really mean by that is we were thinking about the philosophy of the mind We were thinking about the philosophy of our own personal experiences. And for me, it was about trying to see if our experience of our own inner life is consistent philosophically with our scientific picture of the physical world. So the metaphysics of consciousness is the technical term.
These are difficult words, not just for non-native English speakers and the people listening to this podcast, but metaphysical consciousness is something that I would say 95% of all English speakers wouldn't even know the words, and even fewer people understand what they mean.
I'll just add that that's something that you find a lot in philosophy, but probably in other academic disciplines as well, is that you end up getting what's often referred to as jargon. Now, jargon is a great English word to mean technical language that nobody really understands. It's a negative word, jargon. If you describe something as jargon, you think it's not a very good way to express it. However, I think the reason we get this a lot in philosophy and the reason we get this in a lot of academics is because we want to speak about something very specific that actually we don't really have great words for in normal day-to-day speech. So we end up taking particular words, sometimes new words, but often just quite uncommon words, and giving them a specific meaning for that context, which is useful. But the problem is it really makes it difficult for people to explain it to other people because you're constantly using these words that people, even especially other native speakers, don't normally use or understand in that context. Did you find the same thing in your politics studies?
Definitely in politics and international relations, and especially in political philosophy, which is a very big branch of political science. It's the study of philosophy as it applies to society and politics. There's a lot of jargon. And part of the time, it's important because technical words allow you to talk about ideas that are impossible to describe without those words. But some of the time, people just use jargon to make themselves sound more intelligent. There's a fine line between using scientific or philosophical or these almost jargonistic words in a useful way. And then there is also the I'm going to put as many words as I can into my sentence because they sound really intelligent. And then you hand in your essay and your professor says, this doesn't make sense.
This really makes me think of that moment in the TV show Friends when Joey writes this very important letter. Joey is, if you haven't seen it, a character that's quite well known for not being the smartest or the most intelligent character. He wants to sound more intelligent, and he replaces almost every word in the letter with something else he's found in the thesaurus. The real sign about how stupid this is that even his name, he finds an alternative. His name is Joey, and he replaces this with
Yes.
baby kangaroo.
Going back to studying at Cambridge, can you tell us about the application process? Because I'm sure many people listening are interested in either studying at university, maybe in the UK, maybe in other countries, maybe doing a master's degree somewhere. I know I have people right now doing their master's degrees in the UK. So can you tell us about the application process to Cambridge?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can talk about my experience. I think the first thing I should say is that we should acknowledge that the application process is going to be a little bit different depending on your subject and also on your specific degree. Before, obviously, I'd started the master's. I actually had a year out when I did some other things, but mostly to focus on the application process. My application process for me was very much about demonstrating what I had done in my undergraduate degree, specifically the writing and the dissertation. And then secondly, trying to suggest what I wanted to research in the master's. I think research is always a bit of a funny word for philosophy because we're not doing any experiments or much of what most people would think of as research. It really is, we're writing our own opinions on things and reading, I suppose. For me, the key parts were they were writing samples. So this is evidence of stuff that I've already written. Now, this doesn't have to be things that were examined in my undergraduate course, but they often are. And then you also have to do something for this MPhil, something which was a little bit like a PhD proposal, but a very, very mini one. That you have to propose what you would want to write your master's dissertation about and explain why that's interesting, important, why you're qualified to do it, and very importantly, why you think that department is well suited to that research.
A good point here is that not every university in the UK makes you submit writing samples. I was accepted to King's College London and SOAS in London, so the School of Oriental and African Studies. They just want your CV and a personal statement. And another important point, something that I've had to help people from the USA with, is that the USA and the UK has very different ideas about what to include in your university application. Like you mentioned, a UK university application is very serious. It's about what you studied and what you want to study and why you're a good student.
It's a really good point. I mean, you do write a personal statement. And in this personal statement, I suppose you want to come across as a good person. But I think you've really hit the nail on the head with that point, which is especially for a postgraduate degree. The key things are proving that you've been a good student already, but also proving that you have a good plan, that you're saying that this idea fits this department.
Do you have any tips or advice for applying to a top university like Cambridge?
Yeah, actually I do, but I've got to say this is just from my experience. I did it one time and I was successful one time. It might not be the same forever. First of all, you want to prove that you were an outstanding student in the studies you've already done. You can write something of a high standard on this subject. The second part is to show that you have a serious plan, right? Very normal that this is a step on the way to a PhD. It's the bridge between a undergraduate degree or sometimes even a normal type of master's and a PhD. Now you're quite set on academia and your idea and that you have a good idea. And then I'd add an extra third part, which I think was really important for me. That was my references. So you will need references from your previous, probably lecturers, professors from your previous university. For me, this was one of the most important parts. The university trusts the word of these high level professors more than they trust what you say about yourself. If I say I'm a great student, they don't necessarily believe me. If the head of department at the University of Liverpool says this guy is a really good student, I think that's quite powerful.
I definitely agree. Not many people will know this, but in the early stages of thinking in English, I had a side business of helping people with the university applications
Oh,
to do
really?
master's degrees in the UK. And I used to say a personal statement or a university application comes down to two very simple questions. It is why you and why the university? Why should they choose you? And then why are you choosing that university? When I did my research in Japan, so I had a scholarship in Japan, I had read in my master's degree, I had read 3 papers and 1 book by my eventual supervisor in Japan.
Mm.
Just in the process of studying. And then when I wrote my application, it was very simple to say, why do I want to study with this person? Because I had read all of their research, I had cited them in my papers, and I wanted to study under them. Right? I wanted to work
Mm.
with this person and learn from them. And so I think showing why is the key. Too many people get focused on what. It's why.
Couldn't have put it better myself. And you reminded me of one other thing I did, which I forgot about, which was just an idea I had myself. And I don't know if this was a bit cheeky or if it's a good idea, but I actually, in the process of applying, I also wrote to the professor at that university who I thought would be my potential supervisor. I wrote to him and I basically asked, do you think you might be interested in doing this if I put in an application to Cambridge University?
So you've now applied to Cambridge, you've been accepted. I want to know a little bit more about the academic life, study life at Cambridge. Perhaps we can start by saying, how were the teaching methods at Cambridge? How did the teaching methods differ from school or other universities? Because I know Cambridge and Oxford are quite unique in how they teach.
Mm. And at this point, I think I need to bring up another thing which made my experience really quite unique at Cambridge, which is the fact I did this 1 year master's, and it was right, unfortunately, during the height of the COVID pandemic. Actually, maybe not the height, let's say the second half. But there was a lot of lockdown measures, and almost everything I did in terms of teaching was predominantly online. The center of the course was online. Most of the lectures took place online, which is a bit of a shame. But the general structure and the teaching methods are the same. For this MPhil, you were very free. The key point of the MPhil is to produce your own research. And really the only work I was examined on in this master's degree was my original writing. And it was only 3 pieces of writing, 1 piece of writing per term. However, the one in the third term is the dissertation, which is the biggest project. So really this overlaps a little bit with the other 2 as well. So you do 2 smaller projects and your whole year is directed at 1 big project as well. That's all you have to do. Actually, I could have done nothing else. If I wanted to do nothing else, that would have been possible. I would have had a supervisor for every piece of writing. That supervisor would have helped me, and they would have almost certainly given me targets and given me deadlines. But you're in control. If you never organize a meeting with your supervisor, then nothing happens. However, there's a lot more teaching. First of all, there is a huge range of really interesting courses that normally last for 1 semester. All of the courses I did were philosophy courses, but you can also take courses in other subjects. But these technically are undergraduate courses. That doesn't mean they've only got undergraduates, but these are things that I'm taking optionally. I'm not taking these to pass the exam. I'm just, we might say, auditing the course, which means I'm just sitting in and listening in order for it to help my research. So every term I would choose certain courses that I thought were relevant to the project I was working. Second part of the studying was really fun. These were what we would call reading groups. So these were just groups of students that would meet once a week and we would discuss certain topics. So we would normally read something, then come to a meeting and discuss it, or even present things to each other, present our ideas or our projects to each other. And these are generally organized by students, but there are often the professors in these groups as well. It's just based on areas of interest.
I think it would be interesting to compare it to my master's degree, which was a much more traditional master's degree in the sense of it's called a taught master's rather than an MPhil, which is a research master's, I guess. So I took 4 classes per semester. They each had a lecture and a seminar as part of this. And then at the end of the year, like at Cambridge, you have to do your dissertation. You're working on that alongside your courses, alongside your taught classes. And you meet with your professor, your supervisor a few times a year to make sure you're staying on track. So it's a very different experience to what is a very self-study schedule at Cambridge. It's up to you to plan your own time, I guess.
You have plenty of support within your college, maybe something we'll go on to, but also within your department. However, at the end of the day, you're studying based on your own impetus, which is like based on your own motivation and based on your own decision to do certain things, not because you are enlisted in a class that you must attend every week or you have homeworks or exams that you have to do. No, you produce your writing, these 3 writings in the year. And other than that, you decide how to spend your time in order to prepare or research those essays the best.
I'm not going to ask you to describe or tell me about your thesis because I'm sure we won't understand it. But I'm just curious, what was the title of your dissertation you submitted?
Okay, right. Let me got to try and remember as well because these titles are never particularly catchy. Okay, it was along the lines of this. It said it was something like, which version of Russellian monism stands up the best to the paradox of phenomenal judgment?
It's not too long, but there's definitely 2 words in there that I do not know. I've never heard before. Right?
There's certainly jargon.
So
There's certainly jargon.
exactly. So I'm curious, it was
Sounds
COVID.
good.
Did you live in Cambridge during COVID or did you stay home?
Yeah, no, I did actually live in Cambridge, although I must say there was a big lockdown, or there was a period of quite strict lockdown in the UK that winter, let's say think it was from towards the end of November until early in the spring. So actually, for most of the winter, I left Cambridge. But at the beginning and end of the year, as I was living in Cambridge, and regressively the whole year, I was paying to rent a place in Cambridge. Generally, in Oxford and Cambridge, when you arrive as an undergraduate, you will stay in accommodation in the university. Specifically in Oxford and Cambridge, that means in your college. However, as a postgraduate, it's kind of 50-50 whether people decide to rent a room in their college or they decide just to rent a private room in the city. I decided to do the latter, right? I decided to do the second option, which is to rent a private room. And I did that for a couple of reasons. It's because the college room that I would have been able to get was quite a long way out of the city. Even though the main college was in the city, it's a historic building, so the size is very limited. So as the college and the university has grown, they have accommodation further away. I wanted to live in the city. And secondly, you often find that the university accommodation is a little bit expensive for what it is. You're getting normally a private room, but you won't necessarily have your own bathroom. You'll have a single bed, this sort of thing. Perfectly okay, perfectly comfortable. I would have been fine with it. However, this is normally the same price as something that's a little bit more comfortable or a little bit bigger in private accommodation. And so that's actually why in the end I decided to rent a room privately in the city.
I stayed in a student accommodation, a dorm, I guess, if you use American English, but it was just postgraduate students who were studying at SOAS. And it was actually really nice. I could meet lots of people.
I think it's really interesting that you recommend staying in the student accommodation because I had a really nice time living in a bit more central in Cambridge. It's not a very big city, but a little bit more central. And I had a good experience where I was living. And I was actually closer to my studies than I would have been in the university. However, I do think there's a real benefit, especially if you're just doing a short course and you want to immerse yourself in the studies and other people that are living similar lives. It's quite nice to live with those other people who are studying postgraduate degrees in the same college, because that might well end up being the center of your social life. So it's probably easier to meet people if you do that.
But so we've learned
It's
about
really
what you studied at Cambridge, your application process, and then a bit about the academic experience and life in Cambridge. So just to end this episode, this interview, I guess, what advice would you give to someone who wants to study in the UK?
really good question. I think, first of all, something that I felt a lot is something we often call in English imposter syndrome, which is the sense that everybody else is a bit more qualified or a little bit more able than you. And you're there and you're not quite good enough for what you're doing, right? So I think this definitely happens to me at Cambridge because it's quite a high level and many people have some great achievements or they speak in a very intelligent way about the subject. And the main advice I want to give for this feeling is that everybody is feeling. And even if everybody's not feeling this, the people that aren't feeling it, they're probably the ones making the mistake. They're probably a little bit too self-confident. My second piece of advice would be to try to meet people as much as you can at the beginning. Even if you're a little bit of an introverted person, I think you'll find there are plenty of other introverted people on the course. And I'm not saying you have to go and be super social and super extroverted at the beginning, but make relationships. Introduce yourself to people at the beginning. The easiest time to introduce yourself to people is right at the beginning, right? It might seem weird just to go and ask someone their name on your course, but at the beginning of the course, this is what everybody wants to do and is a bit nervous about doing. And having that network and that community of people that you know, this is going to make those more difficult moments in the course so much easier. Not just for emotional support, friendships, but just because you're surrounded by other people having the same experience and you won't feel so alone and isolated, which is something I felt going to a new city in Cambridge. So those are my two pieces of advice.
If you want to know more about imposter syndrome, one of my most popular episodes is about imposter syndrome, I think from 2 years ago, maybe. And then the final thing I want to ask is, you're now an English teacher. I'm sure many people know you from conversation clubs and the courses you run and your workshops. How can non-native English speakers or English learners improve their academic English to prepare for studying abroad, studying in the UK, studying in the USA? How can you study academic English?
So I think I think you do need to reach a certain level. I think these CESR levels of B1, B2, C1 are not the whole story when it comes to English learning. Don't become obsessed with them, but they're a useful guideline. And I would have thought to study at a university in a native English speaking country, I would say if you're not at the C1 level, it's going to be a lot more difficult. More or less, you want to be at that C1 level. And then I think it's just about what is the material which you study. I think if you have some English lessons or if you decide to take an English course, I think key thing is that the source of materials, the sort of things you're reading or listening to or talking about or writing are in this context. So they use that type of English, that type of vocabulary, the types of sentence structures that are often used in academia, and you'll get used to these. So make sure you're reading academic English and exposing yourself to this type of English.
I completely agree. You need to read academic English, not popular English, right? If you want to study philosophy at Cambridge University, you really need to be reading journal articles from philosophy journals rather than
Absolutely.
the book you can buy at the local bookstore.
I think that's absolutely vital. Don't try and go to study in English if you don't have experience of reading the type of things you will read when you study, because it might not be exactly the same as what you're used to.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us in this interview. I'm sure people now know a lot more about you, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's been a pleasure to chat, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Thank you so much to Peter for coming on and being a guest on the podcast. I think Peter had some really interesting things to say. His experience of studying at the University of Cambridge is something that I'm jealous of, and I'm sure many of you are interested in and want to do yourself or want family members to do. Studying at a top university like Cambridge is an amazing accomplishment, and I'm glad Peter could share his story with us. Peter didn't really want to promote himself, but I'm going to promote him anyway. If you're interested in English classes with Peter, go to peterenglish.com. That is peter-english.com. He offers private classes, English courses, and workshops. There is something for everyone, from very affordable workshops to more exclusive private one-on-one classes with Peter. You don't often get a Cambridge-educated philosopher teaching English at a high level. So I think it's really worth going and checking out his classes. You can also find Peter in the Thinking in English Patreon events. Peter runs the 6 p.m. UK time conversation clubs, and he also runs the Thinking in English film club as well. So thank you so much for Peter for coming on. I'll put the links to Peter's courses below, and I'll also put the Patreon discount code for Patreon members as well. One of my goals for 2025 is to do more interviews. In January, you had the interview with my wife. February, you're having Peter's interview. So going forward, I want to do more interviews. If you'd like to be a guest on an interview with me, send me a message. I am planning to interview some of my Patreon subscribers to be on the Thinking in English podcast, bonus episodes, and maybe even YouTube channel if that's something you're interested in. So send me a message and we can discuss and maybe get you on the podcast as well. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'll speak to you next time. Goodbye.